Okay, so this is a Spring MVC Basic 1. So we are going to cover some basic concept of Spring MVC. So I'll talk about the concept of dispatch servlet, and then we'll talk about how you can construct context configuration files for Spring MVC application. And today we are going to focus mostly on controller. So we'll cover annotation-based controllers, how the request could be mapped to handlers, and URI template concept, and a few other things. So mostly we are going to focus on controllers. So before we move on, let's talk about Spring MVC concept a little bit. So Spring MVC is MVC, Model View Controller-based Web Application Framework. It is in fact the most popular MVC framework out there. And just like any other modern MVC framework, it really based on design principles of dependency injection or inversion of control, and interface-driven design, and POJO everywhere, and test-driven development. So I'm not going to actually spend too much time on explaining each of these concepts. So these are, in fact, well-understood concepts. So I'm going to actually use a couple of slides to talk about the features of Spring MVC. Just kind of give you a sense of features of Spring MVC. In fact, these are the features that are common in modern web application frameworks, MVC-based web application frameworks. So clear separation of roles. So these are examples of roles, and we are going to spend understanding each of these roles or functionality of this MVC framework in detail in the rest of this course. Again, it's a separation of roles is important because it allows you to actually select or plug in different implementation, for example, of a validator, and without affecting the rest of the framework or an application. So each of these functionality could be actually evolving. In fact, Spring MVC framework could evolve without the affecting rest of the parts. For example, you could actually plug in different validator without affecting rest of the framework and your application. Powerful and straightforward configuration. So both framework and applications themselves are configured with XML-based Java beans, meaning XML file you specify a set of Java beans, and each of those Java beans could be in fact implementation of controller, a validator, or command object. For application, you're going to have your beans as some business logic implementation. Adaptability and non-intrusiveness and flexibility. So for example, this is an example. So you can define any method, and then you can annotate that method as a controller handler. In fact, from Spring Framework, Spring MVC 2.5, you are going to use annotation pretty extensively. And by using annotations, in fact, you don't have to implement the specific Spring Framework specific interface. You don't have to extend the Spring Framework specific classes. Okay? So it's non-intrusive. In fact, those are POJO classes. And adaptable, meaning your class method could be actually changing without actually changing its characteristic of controller, things like that. Customizable binding. Binding, when we say binding, we are talking about conversion and validation. So these are common features of any MVC framework. Customizable handler mapping and view resolution. So we're going to actually spend quite a bit of time learning the handler mapping view resolution in this presentation as well as next week. So the pretty flexible way of mapping your URL request to a particular handler of a particular controller, and selection of the view technology as well. Flexible model transfer. This is pretty powerful feature of Spring MVC. So basically you can think of a model as a collection of name value, the attributes. Okay? And basically you can access these models in your views. Customizable locale and theme resolution, and it does come with a Spring Tech library as well. Okay. All right, so let's move on to dispatcher servlet. Okay, let me see. I think there are a few questions. I'm going to actually address some questions later on. Okay, question from Il. Do you cover Spring form flow? So you're talking about the Webflow. If that's the case, yeah, we're actually covering Webflow. Okay. All right, so let's move on to Dispatcher Servlet. So Dispatcher Servlet is a built-in servlet from Spring Framework. It is provided by Spring Framework, and it plays the role of front controller in an MVC framework. So basically, it plays the role of front controller, receiving incoming HTTP request, and then it will delegate the request handling to a controller. And controller is basically set up handlers that actually handles the request. And as part of the handling of the request, controller method, meaning handler method, will create a model object. It will set attributes in the model object, and then the views can actually access those models. And these views could be actually generating views that could be displayed to the user. Okay, and because Dispatcher Servlet is just genuine servlet, it has to be configured in web.xml file, and we are going to see that in the following slide. So this is basically a repeat of what I just said in the previous slide. So it received the HTTP request, and it will select the controller based on URL handler mapping, and then it will pass the request to a handler of the controller. And the controller, actually handler of the controller, performs the business logic and set values of model object. So basically set up the value pair, the key value pairs as an attribute. And then controller returns a logical view, and then view resolver implementation class will handle the selection of a particular view technology, whether that is a JSP or PDF or Excel, things like that, based on configuration, of course. And then a view will actually use the values of this model object for displaying to the user using this view technology. So this is how you configure Dispatcher Servlet. So as I said before, Dispatcher Servlet is just like regular servlet. So you have specified in servlet class, you give a name, and you are going to have a mapping. So for this servlet, meaning for this servlet, we'll map with, in this case, /. Okay? So basically, you are delegating all requests coming in to Spring Framework. Okay, slide number 11. So Spring Context Configuration. So Spring Context Configuration is typically in the form of XML file. As you have seen before, you can certainly configure the configured information in Java code, okay, but still most of the configuration will be done in the form of XML file. So you could have multiple context configuration files. For medium and large size project, you might have a root context file. So in this root context file, you are going to define beans shared by all servlets and filters. Okay, so besides the Dispatcher Servlet, if you happen to have another servlet, for example, if you want to configure with another, let's say, framework such as Trust2, that whatever beans you define in root context file will be shared by all servlets. And you could have one or more web context files for each Dispatcher servlet. For each Dispatcher servlet, you could have one or more context configuration files. So best practice guideline is in fact indicating that you want to have multiple context files based on some functionality. So you might have the servlet context file for defining some beans. You might have beans defined in data source context file. You might have beans defined in web security related context file. And you might have scheduling beans in scheduling context files. So you could actually specify all these XML context files in one single web context file, or each of these could actually import the other. Okay, so that's actually completely up to you. And we'll see examples of this one moving forward. So this is a web XML file in which we defined, let's say, root context file. So you specify the context config location parameter value, and then you specify root context file. And for dispatcher servlet, you can also specify the web context configuration file. So, this is the servlet-context file. Okay. And again, this file could actually import other context files instead of having everything in a single file. So this picture shows we have, in fact, 3 context configuration files. So one is root context XML file, and then we have servlet context XML file, and then we have a controllers.xml file. So here, controllers.xml file, we define all the controller related beans, and the other web related beans will be defined in servlet context.xml file, and in this case servlet context file imports controller.xml file. Okay, so default location and name of the context file. So if you do not specify your the servlet context file, dispatcher servlet context file, like in web.xml file, then Spring will search the default web context file in this form. So /webinf and the name of the servlet, and then servlet.xml file. Okay. So again, typically you are going to specify this location in web.xml file, for example, as we have seen like this. However, if you do not specify this dispatcher servlet context file, suppose if you did not have these 4 lines of code in web.xml file, then Spring Framework will search for the dispatcher servlet context file in this location with this name. So webinf and servlet name and dash servlet.xml file. So as an example, suppose if your servlet is called, its name is app servlet, and if you have not specified so in this case you have not specified the context file using init param, the sub-element, right? So in this case, Spring will search the app servlet, name of your servlet, dash servlet.xml file. Okay, so this is a file Spring Framework will search for. Okay. Okay, so web context configuration file. So the file we are talking about is this file. So in this file, you are going to specify, a few beans that are relevant for Spring MVC. For example, you can specify controllers, you can specify handler mappings, you can specify set of view resolvers, locale resolvers, theme resolvers, and multi-part file resolver. This is for file upload, and the handler exception resolvers. So as part of this course, we are going to cover all this. So moving forward, Spring MVC interfaces. As we talked about as part of the in the beginning of this presentation, we said that Spring MVC is based on interface-driven design, right? So basically, the Spring MVC has a set of key interfaces, and then it will have set of built-in implementation of these interfaces. So basically, the interfaces are representing the functionality of this, like the controllers and the view resolvers and locale resolvers and things like that. Okay. Okay, so this is a key feature of Spring MVC because it actually allows a modularization of Spring MVC frameworks. So basically, the application will use these interfaces, but you can plug in different implementations of these interfaces. So in fact, this is how Spring Framework itself can be extended and customized. So you can plug in different implementation. So Spring Framework comes with a built-in implementation of these interfaces. So in most cases, usage of default implementation, usage of this built-in implementation should be enough. 95% of the time, but maybe in some cases you might want to write your own custom implementation, for example, validator or the controller. Okay, but in many cases the built-in implementation should be good enough. And also Spring Framework will select the default implementation for you. Okay, so unless you want to use a different implementation, you don't have to specify anything. So this is basically a concept of default over configuration, another design principle of many frameworks. Okay, so these are examples of SpringMVC interfaces. Handler mapping. This is Java interface, and it is handling mapping of requests to handlers. Okay, so there are a few implementations that come with a Spring Framework. View resolver, it maps symbolic name to view technology. And handler exception resolver, so it maps the exceptions to error pages, and it's more powerful than standard servlet's way of actually handling exceptions. And locale resolver, so it selects locale based on either accept header information or a cookie. Okay, so we're going to cover all these things moving forward. Alright, so let's move on to controllers. As I said before, rest of the presentation is understanding these controllers, SpringMVC controllers. So what does controller do? So controller provides access to business logic. So typically, your business logics will be in the form of services and a set of services, and your handler in your controller will call those services for actual business logic processing, and these services in turn will access database through DAO interface. So controllers receive user input, and then it also transform it into model and set attributes, key value pairs of a model as a result of into model, and then as part of the business logic processing, set of attributes in the form of key value pairs will be set in the model object, so that model object could be accessed in a view. Okay, so moving forward. Annotation based controllers. By the way, these is level of importance. So we have 4 star of 5, meaning this is very important concept. So before Spring MVC 2.5, you had to extend Spring specific based controller classes because pre 2.5 did not use annotations. So you had to extend, for example, simple form controller and multi-action controller and things like that. The downside of this approach, of course, is that your code is tied up with, in this case, particular framework, in this case a Spring framework. Okay, for some reason if you want to change to some other framework, then it's not going to be that easy, right? So in this case your classes are not in fact POSA. Okay, Spring 2.5 now introduced annotation based controllers, and annotation based controllers do not have to extend Spring specific based controller classes like a simple form controller. You still can do if you want to. And you don't have to implement Spring-specific interfaces either. And annotation-based controllers do not usually have any direct dependencies on Servlet or Portlet APIs either. So in fact, they are POSA classes. Okay. So this is example code. So here we have controller, which is called Hello World controller. So you can actually have this controller in any name of your choice, and you can see it doesn't extend any Spring Framework specific class, right? So it doesn't have any tie-in to Spring Framework. Instead, you're going to use @controller annotation. Okay. And then we have a method. This is a handler method, Hello World. So you can name it in any way you want. And then you can have any set of parameters, and those parameters could have any type, it could be any type. So there is no restriction in terms of the name of your handler method, and there is no restriction in terms of how many parameters you can have and the types of the parameters. Okay. So no constraint to the method signature. Okay, so to enable this annotated controllers, you have to have MVC annotation driven element in your context configuration file. Okay. So next week we are going to cover XML Namespace Concept. For example, this MVC, and then this is a default namespace. So we'll talk about the concept of default namespace, target namespace, and source namespace, and things like that. Okay. So here, this is beans is the default namespace, and this MVC is one of the source namespace. So you have to specify this prefix here with annotation driven. So you specify annotation driven here by having this this line in your context configuration file. Basically, you are registering these two classes. Okay, so if you do not use this one, you have to declare these two classes in your context configuration file. Okay, so by having